Welcome to NAB 2018 and the Grass Valley booth here at the South Hall, lower level, booth 106. We're going to talk with Mark Hilton, who is the Vice President of Live Production Products, and we're going to jump right into talking about High Dynamic Range, HDR.
Okay.
Now, Grass Valley frequently talks about native HDR, and how does this differ from all the other types of HDR that are out there in the world?
Well, when we say native HDR, we're talking about right out of the camera, providing the best possible HDR signal that then can be taken throughout the entire production chain. Some other alternative approaches have opted for a conversion that might happen downstream, which really just impacts the quality of that signal. So inside the camera, we can either do PQ or HLG. Those are the two primary standards, the only two that have been standardized. We can also modify and tweak those inside the camera at very high bit rates so that the quality is maintained. When it exits the camera, it comes out at 10 bits and it's ready for production.
Okay, so we've got HDR in the camera, but that's not where HDR ends, it's where HDR begins. So how is Grass Valley addressing the full HDR production ecosystem?
Yeah, well, we definitely have HDR. HDR at 10-bit can pass through an existing 10-bit set of products, but more importantly, the up mapping, down mapping and such is necessary to be included in that path. So we're building a lot of that into our products, our production switcher, our replay systems and so forth, our networking products, to be able to manage that, bring in various different types of formats, so we have a cohesive, high quality signal throughout the entire production chain.
So in addition to HDR, when we talk about 4K UHD, there's also wide color gamut. And people confuse it, they think wide color gamut's a part of HDR or whatever. So let's talk about wide color gamut.
So what wide color gamut means is it's just more colors. The eyeball can see lots of colors, but the television takes a subset of those. So we're moving from a Rec 709 to 2020, which gets us much closer to what we can actually see in the real world. So it's a different concept. We tend to talk about it sort of in conjunction with HDR because neither of them require extra bandwidth as opposed to 4K, which is also part of UHD. And those naturally go together. So when we say we can do HDR in our cameras, we can also do wide color gamut. And there is a possibility to convert back and forth between 709 and 2020 color, independent of HDR. But it's very compelling, and also we believe that along with HDR, for most consumers, will probably have a bigger impact visually than a 4K image.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because a lot of people think HDR and 4K as sort of here's one and the same and everything else, and it's true that HDR and wide color gamut are part of 4K, but they're not locked to 4K.
Right.
You can do HDR in 1080p 3G, and how does that work out?
Well, we actually have a specific camera that we built and optimized for that. It's not a 4K camera, it's a 1080p or 3 gig camera that does very high quality HDR, the native HDR that we've been talking about. We expect certain countries to that's what they're going to do. When they adopt HDR, it will not be 4K. So you can disaggregate these four things within UHD. There's the high resolution, 4K, there's HDR, there's wide color gamut, and there's also high frame rate, which we haven't really seen yet other than for replay systems and so forth, but it's possible to actually transmit higher frame rate, 48 frames, 50, 60, or I'm sorry, up to 100, 120 frames. But that's of course going to require more bandwidth. So you can, it's a bit of a menu you can choose from the standard. What we've seen mostly is interest in 4K, but also now 1080p 3 gig with HDR or wide color gamut.
Okay, so we've got HDR now coming out of the camera, we've got HDR in switchers and we can handle HDR, but we've got a gigantic archive of material from the SDR world. So how do we handle productions today that rely on archive footage or historical footage?
And I'll add to that, there's a lot of existing products such as character generators or graphics that may not support HDR. So what we need to do is upmap that into the HDR space. What you want to have when you go into a production switcher or a monitor for that matter is to have a consistent format, whether it be SDR, standard dynamic range, or HDR. So we've developed upmapping technology that we've embedded into our products. You can buy that as deploy it as a separate modular product or within a switcher or within a replay system that will upmap that to HDR. So take all that archive footage, bring it up to HDR and use it that way.
So there's both automatic algorithmic conversions and more manually adjustable conversions for HDR. And there are some SDR things that need to maybe go into the HDR world. There's some HDR stuff that needs to go to the SDR world. And so how does that all work?
Yeah, so it turns out that the upmapping process is actually quite simple because you're taking a smaller dynamic range and mapping it into a larger. Going the other direction, we have a wider range, and you're trying to decide how to map that into the standard dynamic range. This is where you have to apply some decisions. Those can be done manually with a shader, an individual who's looking at the image and adjusting just for the right look, and then that can be fixed and be static. And that works nicely in a studio environment where you understand the lighting. But in cases where the lighting is unknown or not deterministic, you can apply these automatic or dynamic mappers. And we've tested those out. There are some on the market that work quite well. So as part of our ecosystem, our process, those fit in nicely. Normally we recommend you produce everything in HDR, and then just before going out to your SDR channel, you would do that down mapping, whether it be static or dynamic.
So with those sort of preset profiles, it's sort of like on the camera side where we have LUTs and lookup tables. If you're looking for a certain look, you just say, I want you to look like,
right,
and we're good and we're off to the races.
Exactly. So you can, that's how a lot of these dynamic systems work, is they will analyze the image and then apply a lookup table based on that input. Or you can just select a LUT, lookup table, for a particular environment and just fix it that way. So that's the static versus the dynamic.
Okay, great. So Mark, if there's one thing you want people to take away from Grass Valley at this year's NAB, whether it's about HDR or anything else in live production, what would that be?
Well, I think given the topic of HDR, it's that we really understand that full workflow. We've been working for years in this area. We have a lot of experience, we've done a lot of proof of concepts, so we can be a trusted partner in this area for our customers that are interested in moving in that direction.
Excellent, thanks Mark. And thanks for joining us from the Grass Valley booth at NAB 2018.